Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter. We are in an interesting time. We are at the time sort of in between. We all know what's going on. We know what's happening in our cities and in cities across the world, but we don't know what's going to happen next. Tomorrow, there's going to be more protests. More of them are going to turn violent. The day after that, more. Trump seems to be sitting on his hands, except when he's saying something extraordinarily stupid, which is at least once a day now, but it's still, he's waiting. And that may or may not be a smart move, depending. At a minimum, perhaps he could find a way to try to fix the problem. But I think he has recognized it's beyond his skills to fix. His instincts are going to result in the worst possible decisions being made, which is an escalation of this. I live in Massachusetts. There have been some riots in Boston, and now have spread to the largest city, second largest city, Worcester, which is not far. I can actually, when I take these off, I can hear them now. And I think I'm not unique in that. Most of us have heard or experienced these things personally in one way or another. We've Those of us who are on YouTube have done what we sort of know best, which is that we have gone on and spoken about it, just recorded it or done it live. I'd like to thank Chris Mowdy for having me on his stream earlier today, and we've seen Shannon Q had on Mr. Nate Brody, and they talked about some good streams, but it's we're waiting to see what happens next. And one of the concerns that I have is we can't forget COVID, which has now exceeded the previous record for a number of new cases a day across the world. It's going up again, and we haven't really seen it start to go up in the way that it's going to, because the riots are still reasonably new, and the opening of states is reasonably new. So I'm concerned about what happens when the medical system starts to get overwhelmed. Our policing system in the U.S. is already obviously overwhelmed. And we have a couple of things to discuss on that front. I do think with all this that's going on, we did not air yesterday, and I think we may. I don't think we're going to be doing daily unless there's really breaking news or something new or unique that happens, and it does feel like there's something new and unique almost every day. But this is a bit like COVID. When COVID really started to become a regular thing, we there was no point in covering it every single day anymore. So we're gonna sort of, I think, play it by ear as to how and when we're gonna do shows, unless there's breaking news or something reasonably significant. And there have been a few things today that I think are worth punctuating. I will say before we continue that we will be having in the coming weeks Christopher Mowdy on to discuss science communication, which I think is a subject that's not always well understood. Matt Dillahunty will be on to discuss the importance of debate. Do we need formal debates in this society, or do we just, is there any use to them anymore? I think for people in my community, the last person who was really thought to do those well and that people respected was Christopher Hitchens. And, we still see Sam Harris still debates. I think they're valuable. I think Bill Nye's debate against Ken Ham was, I think, extraordinary for many reasons. And look forward to talking with Matt Dillahunty about that in the coming weeks. On May 25th, 2020, 11 days ago, George Floyd was arrested in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was clearly inebriated under the influence of a couple of different substances. He was sluggish, but from what was recorded by multiple cameras from multiple angles, he appeared to follow all police orders. All of them. Never resisted arrest. He was asked to get up, move over to a wall, sit down against the wall, get back up again. We've seen all this. At some point, he was thrown to the ground, pinned against the wheel of the police car, and 2 officers held him down while a third put his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck. The exact timeline for what happened next has been contested a bit, but what we know is after a few minutes, he had started complaining that he couldn't breathe. He lost consciousness. They appear to remain on his neck even after he had lost consciousness. Call the ambulance. The ambulance shows up, takes him to the hospital, and he is pronounced dead. This is a man who... The only crime that I'm aware of was drunk in public and maybe passing bills that weren't any good at a convenience store. Whether or not he knew they were any good or not is really... He didn't seem to do anything wrong, certainly didn't do anything violent that anyone could tell, and he died for it. This is a reasonably common scene in the U.S. It's more common in the U.S. than in most other countries, but it happens in other places, which is why, while that night in the city of Minneapolis, Minnesota, there were protests. The protests the next day spread to 4 cities, then spread to 15, then 24, 30. Now there's over 150 cities across the United States, and in dozens of countries, people are protesting. The protests are about the people who work for us, who protect all of us equally, and have failed to do that. And they failed to do that in many countries, again, most noticeably in the U.S. It was said earlier, and I thought this was apropos and very interesting, that to the accusations of police violence, the police have, in a number of cases, responded with escalating violence. Martin Gino is a 75-year-old man who was in Buffalo, New York today. We're going to show you the video of what happened. This is, of all the video that I've seen, perhaps some of the most brutal and violent. It is difficult to watch. It's a warning. This is Martin Gino. He is a 75-year-old man approaching the emergency response team in Buffalo today.
He is bleeding out of his ears. He's bleeding out of his ears. He's bleeding out of his ears. Get him medic. What the fuck you walking up on me? I'm moving down. Get the fuck away. Stop. Y'all don't want this shit. Back up. Get off the steps. Let's go. Get back. Get back.
Better get an ambulance for him.
We have EMT on scene.
All right. Once again, that was Mr. Martin Gino, who was shoved hard by a emergency response team police officer. Another officer appears to have been involved in the shoving. At one point, he goes back, he hits his head and loses consciousness. Blood is coming out of his ears. He is currently in the hospital. He is in serious but stable condition. He is responsive. At 75, I have to believe a blow like that, he may never recover. Most people that age, they break a bone, they anything. And I think I apologize. I do think now that I've explained it, I will probably, and it came in late, so I'm going to show it one more time. Martin Gino. He is, and you've seen it, I'll describe it one more time and then we'll see it again. He is shoved. He is approaching the police officers with his cell phone. He was armed with a cell phone. He's shoved, falls back, hits his head, loses consciousness. Blood starts coming out his ears. The officers notice it. You can actually hear the officers talk about it. And one does attempt to maybe go in and help him. Others pull him off, and they all continue. One officer calls an ambulance. Nobody checks vitals. Nobody checks to see if he's conscious or functioning in any meaningful way. So once again, we will See, this is Mr. Martin Gino in Buffalo, New York, earlier today.
He is bleeding out of his ear. He's bleeding out of his ear. He's bleeding out of his ear. Get him medic. What the fuck you walking up on me? I'm moving down. Get the fuck away. Move back. Y'all don't want this shit.
Back up. Get off the steps. Let's go. Get back. Get back.
Better get an ambulance for him.
We have EMT on scene.
The two officers most directly involved were suspended shortly thereafter. In a show of solidarity, 57 officers of that unit all immediately resigned. They resigned because the officers in question were suspended pending an investigation. I've spoken about this before. One of the problems is the inability of officers to police themselves. Because of what happened, two officers are suspended. That's exactly what should happen. Even best case scenario, somehow, legitimately, none of this is their fault. Suspended until you have an investigation. Just for doing that, nearly the entire unit resigned. The only ones who didn't resign are the ones who were on sick leave and didn't show up today. All the rest are gone. The Buffalo Police Department Benevolent Association President John Evans said, quote, "These officers resigned in disgust because of the treatment of two of their members who were simply executing orders." This highlights the complaint about police brutality, which we see echoing through so many countries in the world tonight, which is that yes, being a police officer in the United States can be a very dangerous job. He was a 75-year-old man who was shoved. 75 years old. Does he deserve to die because he was there? This is exactly what the protests are about. I'll be honest with you, if they want to resign, good. They should go and never come back. It may not be easy to replace them, but nobody even fired these officers. It was just, we'd like to look into it, and everyone says, nope, you don't get to do that or we leave. Fine, go. Get the fuck out. Seriously? This is the problem. This is what's starting it. This is what's making it worse. We seem to have this cultural, and again, there's been a lot of discussion of this, and it's a small community I'm with. It's only the people in general who know how to use Discord, the people who watch these things on YouTube. So this isn't a sample of America, but a number of the people I've spoken with have said, well, gee, it is what it is. Police officers are human beings. There's no way to make it better. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, it's better by a lot, objectively so. At this point, we're going to have a show on precisely how and why. And we've covered this before. We covered prison reform, which is a very similar topic. But their officers have come to the United States sometimes to sort of teach Americans how to, and we're flabbergasted. I don't know, this thinking by usually the right wing is that America is the greatest country in the world, but our people are so savage that they can't be policed with dignity. They can't be policed in a way that doesn't necessitate you assuming everybody, including an unarmed black man in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a guy trying to break into his, not trying to break into his home, sorry, a guy just trying to get into his home in New York, unarmed, his own apartment, shot 57 times because he was black trying to get into a house. Or a 9-year-old girl, pepper sprayed. All of these people, you had to must assume they're armed and kill them before there's any doubt. If you treat people like criminals and animals, they're going to start to act that way. That's why the response to this can't be for the police to escalate it. It can't be for the police to do what they did to 75-year-old Martin Gugino today. And any officer that thinks that that's okay shouldn't be on a police force anywhere in this country. I'll stand by that. I'll stand by that. I'm a little tired of making grandiose declarative statements. I'm trying to stay impartial. I don't think I can. There's no way to do that. And we're going to cover that again briefly in a moment. There was a marvelous video of Scandinavian police officers coming to the United States to help show in sort of an officer exchange program where officers in Scandinavia and the U.S. were exchanged, and we could see how they did it and they could see how we did it. They were shocked and horrified at how we treated our own citizens. We shut up there and said, well, this could never work in the U.S. Of course it could work in the U.S. Of course it could work in the U.S., especially if we are this great country we're supposed to be. The reason it doesn't work in the U.S. is because everybody assumes it can't work in the U.S., and so they make sure that that's the case. If you assume it's not going to work, it's not going to work. Pro tip. This is four Swedish officers off duty in a New York subway station. They encountered two men who became dangerous. This is how they handled it.
Take it easy. Huh? Punching him, he was murdering him. He was
Please,
on his face.
let me go. That's what I tell you.
That's okay.
I can't breathe.
Take it easy.
I can't breathe.
Hey, sir, calm down. Okay? Everything will be okay. Are you injured? No. Okay? Mike, I'm not riding the train together.
Are you injured? Are you okay? Am I hurting you? Questions they asked. The suspects, not really in their custody because they can't operate as law enforcement officers, but they had certainly subdued and calmed and spoke with the suspects. Indeed, I've seen a number of stories of times when police officers in Canada, in some of the, the U.S. is one of the worst countries for police brutality, but there is in other countries. But I've heard stories in Canada, some Scandinavian countries, where police officers just sit there and they just talk to suspects. There's an idea. Just talk to them, talk them down, finally get them to come down. And we know this works. We've seen it work. There was a time we're more concerned with it, certainly, than we are now. This is Denver police firing paint pellets at a car. They hit a passing car. The owner of the car got out. He had done nothing wrong. There was no, it was perfectly legal for him to be out at that time, but he got out and started yelling at the officers who had fired on the car with paint pellets while he was driving and she was pregnant. This is what happened.
You shot a car with a pregnant woman in it. With tear gas. That motherfucker ain't going nowhere. Shoot it again. She's pregnant. Shoot it again. There's a pregnant woman in the car.
Guys yelling at the cop. Obvious answer, shoot some more. That is a uniquely American attitude. I'm sorry to say, and I don't think it has to be that way. But that's the way it is, and I don't know what it's going to take to change it. When in the NFL, there was a growing movement to kneel during the American singing of the national anthem. Roger Goodell came out and condemned that action. Now, there was some talk that perhaps privately he was more for it, but publicly this was a business decision. A lot of NFL fans tend to be a little more conservative, perhaps not quite as much as, say, NASCAR or a few other sports, but certainly NFL, they know which side their bread is buttered on. He came out and condemned it, and honestly, I apologize, I've spaced the name of the man who started it, but he hasn't worked since 2016. And Goodell came out today and said that he thought that was a mistake, and they should have supported their his employees more. Well, now is better than never, but it shouldn't be that hard to see what's right. And I know doing what's right is hard. That's why we've gotten to the point where we are. But things are only going to get worse. Things are going to get worse. This is going to get worse. Even if something finds a way to quell how things are today, and if anything does it, if we're at a stalemate for another 2 weeks, the coronavirus will end it. The coronavirus will end it. People will be too sick to want to go out, will be my suspicion. So I think we'll have some kind of ending before that. But it'll, okay, fine. 2, 3, 5 years from now, this is all going to happen again. We're very good at kicking the can down the road. We're not particularly good at dealing with the problems as we get them. Fourth Dimensional Jake, another super chat. Thank you very much, Jake. We really appreciate the super chats. I've driven through half a dozen small town USA protests, 5 to 50 plus in most states. These are conservative towns too. A number of the cities protesting must be much higher. I suspect it is. I haven't seen any numbers. I'm still using numbers that are days old, and this has been expanding almost like a coronavirus. This is a logarithmic expansion. It grew very quickly. I don't. It's at least 150. It's probably more. By the way, now that you're here, I would like to speak with you. There was a friend of mine who wanted to interview and at least speak with people. I don't know if they're all going to be on camera or not, and I think it's a short process, but I did want to talk to people who've had experiences. If you could either come into our Discord or reach out to me on Twitter, I'd love to chat with you because you had mentioned some of your experiences, and there are other people here who have seen some of these protests live. I'd like to. We got an idea last time. 2 days ago, it was suggested that we haven't done the COVID hangouts, the Monday COVID stories from lockdown, which I have really appreciated, and I enjoyed hearing people's stories. So thank you all for coming. But lockdown's over for now. We've all sort of grown accustomed to it, and the whole purpose of that was for us to share and try to wrap our heads around this normal that we've now been living. Well, we haven't done it so much now, but I think it may be worth it to do one for how we feel about what's going on, because I think that this is a conversation people need to have, and I would very much like to have it with our audience and anyone who's willing to participate. So, and as I said, I've been doing a lot of that already today, but I think in time should host some of those. So we're going to start doing that. Please connect with us either to our Discord or on Twitter. You can find me, Nicholas Lamar Soutter, Nick Soutter at Twitter. But certainly, Fourth Dimensional Jake, I'd like to hear from you. I'd like to hear from anyone who's willing to talk about it. Hopefully, some of you would be willing to come on the stream and tell us your stories. But at a minimum, like I said, I have a friend who wanted to interview some people. So if I'd like to help you get in touch, connect you guys. So hopefully, we can do that. Donald Trump, who's been a particularly harsh critic of the protest, said today, hopefully George is looking down, saying that this is a great thing that's happening in our country. It's a great day for him, a great day for everyone. This has drawn widespread condemnation. It's essentially flipping positions. He's been against it now that he's gotten pushback from his former defense secretary, his current defense secretary, and now his former chief of staff. He's trying an alternative approach. Former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly has come out in defense of former Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, saying that he also believes that Donald Trump is, quote, the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unify the American people. He continued to say there is a concern, I think, an awful big concern, that partisanship has gotten out of hand. The tribal things have gotten out of hand. Fox News spokeswoman Kayleigh McEnemy, I'm going to have to learn to pronounce that correctly if I'm going to keep bringing her name up, has repeatedly denied that tear gas was used to clear Lafayette Park. Fox News has run with it and said hasn't happened, despite the fact that we have dozens of cameras from multiple sources, both inside and outside the park, and even an Australian film crew proving conclusively that that's not the case. They are lying to us. And by the party that I can tell that most says they want an honest politician. James Hogue, $5, another super chat. Thank you very much, James. We appreciate that. Thank you. You could use a new suit or a bag of Doritos. How do you choose? A bag of Doritos. Bag of Doritos, definitely. Headset too, I suppose. This is, no matter what, I always have a headset. My last headset I loved. I liked it very much. Firmware update, and then poof, I got no control over these things. I think planned obsolescence. So oh well, let's see. Okay. Hold on one second. We appreciate the super chat, and we're also going to do so next week. I'd like to try to this week do a hangout for anyone who wants to talk about what they're thinking. I'd like to have a civil discussion. There are people on both sides of this. There are people who are saying that much of the police behavior is defensible for X, Y, and Z, and that the protests are mostly riotous and violent. And there are other people who say, well, you know, these are all outside instigators. There's a lot of gray area in there. I've made my position reasonably clear, but nonetheless, would like to have a reasonable discussion on this. So we'll do the hangout later. We also still owe all of you a Patreon hangout. We've had a couple of new Patreons, which we really sincerely appreciate. And we'll all get together and we'll talk about also what we're going to do for the show and how it's going to continue and evolve. So, thank you on that, but I think the sort of, like I said, there's a lot of individual incidents, but until something really happens that's going to break the camel's back in one direction or another, either of the institutionalized resistance to reform in this country or of the protesters, until one of those things happen, a lot of this is just continuing to show these stories. They do appear to be escalating, and when there's a dramatic one, as we started to air, everybody I think knew we were going to show that. That's a powerful what happened to Martin Gino. But I want to show you one other one, which actually comes from a channel. We have linked the and I try not to show too much content from other channels because you never know, you can get flagged for it. This guy goes by legal. I think it's worth a sub. I think what he says is worth a sub. It was shown to me, and I thought he put it well. So perhaps I should let him speak for himself. So let me get him queued up now. He's going to be talking about what we've actually already covered repeatedly, and what I just started to mention was about the use of tear gas in clearing Lafayette Park. As you recall, President Trump had given a speech in which he said he was going to end all the riots tonight, and that he was going to force, essentially, the states to take military help, and if the governors could not clear these riots, he would. He then went to a church, the St. John's Church opposite the White House, which had been burned 2 nights prior. He said, I'm going to a very special place. And he went there. He awkwardly held a Bible. He doesn't, it's more lying. It's staging, the likes of which is oh, dear Lord, he's not even very good at it. He's clearly not comfortable doing it. But we'll show you the clip. But in order to get there, he had to clear a number of U.S. citizens who were in nobody's way, who were peaceably assembling. They weren't even protesting, most of them at the time. We told you about the bishop who was giving food and water to people who were there, who were seeking shelter in most cases. He cleared this for one reason and one reason only, the photo op. It hadn't been curfew yet. They were legally assembling. This is Legal Eagle. The link again is in the description on the clearing of Lafayette Park.
Last night, I saw something that I never thought I would ever see on American soil. It was the stuff of tin pot dictators in banana republics. As you probably know, throughout the entire country are protests against police brutality and systemic unfairness and racism. So of course, because this is 2020, the thing that was used to fight those protesting that unfairness and brutality was yet more unfairness and brutality. I never thought I would ever see anything like what happened last night in America. What I saw last night was a threat to our democracy, not foreign, but domestic. A violation of rights, of freedoms, and of laws by the very people who are supposed to protect and execute those laws. Lafayette Square is a place that I know very, very well. I worked downtown for years, and I would often go to Lafayette Park for a coffee or to have lunch outside, and it's a beautiful park right in front of the White House. It's also the site of many protests. There are actually protests there basically 365 days a year. There are people who literally camp out in tents. And given its proximity to the White House, it makes sense as one of the clear protest sites of choice. There have been protests there for decades, if not literally hundreds of years. And while President Trump was giving a speech about domination, he gave the order to clear out all of the protesters who were at and in front of Lafayette Park. President Trump's speech began shortly after 6 p.m. He gave the order to clear out the park at 6:35 p.m. It was a site of a peaceful protest. Not all of these protests have been peaceful, but the one in Lafayette Park was. It was attended by peaceful protesters, by the media.
As we speak, I am dispatching thousands and thousands of heavily armed soldiers, military personnel, and law enforcement officers to stop the rioting, looting, vandalism, assaults, and the wanton destruction of property.
And at 6:35 p.m., he gave the order to round everyone up, to clear them out, and someone, whether it was the president or those acting under his orders, tear gassed the protesters, shot them with rubber munitions, and generally just beat the shit out of them. Federal officers, armed to the teeth, wearing protective riot gear dressed in all black, clad with plastic shields and backed up by what was effectively cavalry on horses, began rounding everyone up and pushing them out. This was the sort of tactic that was designed to get violent. Years of study of crowd control have shown that the way to de-escalate a situation like this is effectively to do the exact opposite. And yet these federal officers wearing riot gear effectively tried to bum rush out peaceful protesters. They came out swinging, literally. There's a video circulating of what one of these federal officers did to an Australian news crew. After running towards the protesters, this particular officer started punching and using his shield as a weapon. He hits the Australian cameraman directly in the stomach, beats him up, sends him on his way. We have video footage not only of what one of the protesters saw happening to this Australian camera crew, but also from the camera crew itself.
Where the state safely.
Oh.
Whoa!
We are really surrounded by the police, and you really saw the way that they dealt with my cameraman Tim. They're quite violent.
What was the reason for expelling these peaceful protesters who were exercising their constitutional right to protest? The president wanted a photo op at a church across the street. He wanted to be able to walk from the White House out the front door, which is rarely done, through Lafayette Park to stand in front of St. John's Church, a non-partisan place of worship. Reports are that little to no warning was given to the protesters ahead of time, and that it was coordinated so that he could end his speech in the Rose Garden and walk directly out to the church.
I'm going to pay my respects to a very, very special place. Thank you very much.
Of course, when he got to the church for his photo opportunity, he turned his back on the church. He didn't pray. He didn't reflect. He didn't even open the Bible he carried with him. He took it out, held it upside down, moved it around in different ways to get the best photo opportunity, stood in front of the church for a minute or two, told the media that it was a Bible.
Is that your Bible?
It's a Bible.
And then left. He cleared out the protesters before the 7 p.m. DC curfew went into effect. And then, in the ultimate irony, the president of law and order stayed past the curfew to get his photo op. And of course, the cherry on top is that after the crowd was being dispersed, the federal government employed military Black Hawk helicopters in a show of force, flying dozens of feet above the crowd in an incredibly dangerous maneuver that I can't recall anything like it ever happening on American soil. Nothing about the president's speech or his photo opportunity was about reconciliation, about progress, about repair, or even about amelioration or de-escalation of the protests. It was calculated only to inflame, to make things worse, to own the libs while desecrating a religious site, while blaspheming the Bible and beating the shit out of protesters. And we saw the end result of this callous move this morning. Just mere hours after it happened, the White House releases a video montage set to music the next day, a campaign stunt brought to you by tear gassing. Some people like Scott Walker had the audacity to say that no one else would have the guts to do what President Trump did, to walk out in front of the crowd. Yeah, it sure takes a real man to order other people with guns to fire munitions at civilians, American citizens exercising their constitutional right to protest, and then walk between 100 armed guards and Secret Service members for a 2-minute photo op after clearing the area. Real guts. Now, I've been referring to these armed guards as federal officers because all reports show that these were not DC cops. DC police generally know how to do crowd control. And while we all have issues with the DC Police Department, the Metropolitan Police Department, I'd like to think that DC cops wouldn't stand for being puppets of the president so he can get a photo op while infringing on people's constitutional rights. Apparently, the DC police were given minimal notice. They were surprised as everyone else. And one of the ultimate ironies of this whole situation is that not only were the DC police totally uninformed about this maneuver, but one of the priests, who was one of the proprietors of St. John's Church, where the president wanted to have his photo opportunity, was expelled from the area so the president could stand there. Mayor Bowser, the mayor of DC, confirmed that nothing in this particular situation warranted the use of munitions against the protesters or the tactics of the riot police.
What we saw was before the curfew time, munitions were released on people who didn't seem to have provoked any attack.
And all of the people in this particular area of DC were in fact peacefully protesting. On this channel, I try to give both sides when there are both sides to a story. There usually are. And in this particular case, yes, there were looting and riots in other parts of the country, but they weren't at the White House. No one is supporting the rioters and the looters, but that's not what was going on here. And it could also be the case that there are bad faith rioters and protesters and looters who are part of an otherwise peaceful protest. That's not the issue here. The issue here is that unequivocally, draconian tactics were used on peaceful protesters. Before curfew started, the stories about the violent protests and the unlawful looting and rioting deserve their own place on the front page of the New York Times. But those stories, as of today, deserve to be at the bottom of the front page, because the headline that should be ringing in every house in America is that the President of the United States ordered draconian measures to expel peaceful protesters so he could get a photo op. I don't know if it's possible to overdose on metaphors, but today is actually election day in DC. I don't know. Something about this whole situation feels different to me on many different fronts. Maybe there are more cameras out today than in the past, and maybe we're just seeing more of what was already there, and I'm sure that's the case. But I also wonder if there is more police abuse that we're seeing as well. When you declare war on America, what you get is a war on America. That when you have federal officers and police dress up like soldiers, they start acting like soldiers. I think in part, what we're seeing today is the result of years of the president's statements, like, if you have a suspect in custody, feel free to rough them up. Don't be too nice on them. The press is the enemy of the people, and that we need to dominate protesters, making no distinction between looters and peaceful protesters. Words have consequences. The president has a bully pulpit, and we shouldn't be surprised when people actually follow the words of an authority figure like the President of the United States. Even though I am a relatively new adopter of the city of Washington, D.C. as their home, I have adopted it. I chose to live here. It's my home, and it's where I'm going to stay. D.C. is a city that has been scarred by the 1968 riots. In many ways, it's only in the last, say, 10 years that it's really begun to heal. And I've seen nothing in the last 24 to 48 hours that has done anything to make things better. And the actions that were taken today threaten that fragile peace. It threatens DC's sovereignty, as it were. DC is not a state. We don't have a governor. Often, the city can't refuse federal troops. And we don't have the representatives, the senators, the governors, and all of the other privileges that the other states have to be able to fight the federal government in the way that they can. This is one of the reasons why DC statehood is so important. Just yesterday morning, in those naive days, I was reading an opinion piece by noted conservative pundit George F. Will. He wrote in the Washington Post, starting by referring to the president's tweets about Joe Scarborough, stating, "Those who think our unhinged president's recent mania about a murder 2 decades ago that never happened represents his moral nadir have missed the lessons of his life. There is no such thing as rock bottom, so assume that the worst is yet to come." I read those words, and I honestly thought that George Will was overreacting. I thought it was a little histrionic. And then, of course, because it's 2020, we all have to eat our own words. And then Lafayette Park happened. Yesterday, the president said,
I am your president of law and order.
This is a president who just weeks ago abdicated all federal responsibility regarding COVID and the coronavirus, calling it a states' rights issue and that the governor should do something about it. And now when it suits him, he aggrandizes himself control of all of the federal officers and the military so that he can do a photo opportunity.
If a city or state refuses to take the actions that are necessary to defend the life and property of their residents, then I will deploy the United States military and quickly solve the problem for them.
And he abuses the authority of the military. This is the kind of show of force that actually escalates into more violence, which is obviously exactly what some people want. Now, things can and will get better. It might not feel like it, but police shootings nationally are down and going lower. Shootings of unarmed people are going down, and accountability is going up. But for things to get better, we're going to have to be proactive about it. And I have to admit that it's even hard for me, an eternal optimist, to be optimistic about the things that I'm seeing on TV last night, today, and probably tomorrow. But what can we do? Well, first, record everything. If you're going to take to the streets, do so peacefully. And please, stop the looters. Civil disobedience not only exists to fight the government itself, but also to fight your fellow man when they're being unreasonable. And if you are going out, please wear a mask. I really, really hope we're out of the woods with respect to COVID. But this could turn bad. We might have to go into quarantine again. I'm truly conflicted because I think a lot of this cause is just, and it's fighting injustice. But the consequences are real. So please be responsible for yourself and with respect to other protesters. Do what you can to not only protect them, but to protect other people's property, and to record injustice wherever you see it, and to publish it so that we have at least a record of it. To the members of the armed citizens who may be asked to turn their weapons against other American citizens, I ask you to reflect and think about your actions before you take them. That the highest form of civil disobedience is to reject an unlawful order, and you may be asked to do so. It's not fair, but we all have to play the hands that we're dealt. And unfortunately, the federal military is probably going to be the tip of the spear on this. And the same goes for the DC Police Department, the Metropolitan Police Department. You don't have to do what we're seeing officers on TV do. There's always a choice. And for everyone else, continue speaking out. I am continually astonished by the outpouring of support that people have given to this cause, and rightfully so. And we're, of course, hearing from the usual suspects. It's no surprise, the people that are in support of these things. But there's some groups of people who I haven't heard from that I would like to. Where are all of those Second Amendment supporters who were so vocal just a couple of weeks ago and who are so silent now when you were asking for a tyrannical government to fight against? Well, now is your chance. If you stay at home thinking that the Second Amendment is more important than the First Amendment, I feel sorry for you. And I think that you should come to the conclusion that your fantasy of being a good guy with a gun, fighting a tyrannical government, is just that. It's just a fantasy. If you were willing to protest a few weeks ago, you should be willing to fight police abuse and systemic violence out there today. And where are all of those freedom of religion folks? The irony of what happened yesterday is that in order to clear out the protesters, the federal government used federal officers to clear out the actual priest who was in charge of St. George's Church. And then the president held out a Bible without opening it, without reading from it. If that's not blasphemy, I don't know what is. Why aren't you being vocal about this abuse of religion for political ends? And where are all of the folks who claim to care about law and order? What we saw last night was pure lawlessness. Just because the federal government does it doesn't mean that it should, and it doesn't mean that it was legal, and it doesn't mean that it was right. If you care about a rule of law that applies to everyone, you ought to be appalled at what happened last night. And besides speaking out, if you could donate to the ACLU, I'll put a link in the description. I would greatly appreciate it. I think there are a lot of folks who are going to need some good legal representation before all of this is out, and I will give to the ACLU as well. By now, you've probably seen this photo. The lights were dark at the White House last night, but the lights have been dark at the White House for a long time. Let's do what we can to bring the light back.
Thank you. Yeah, some things never change. It'll be 20 years from now. I'll still be doing that muted. I showed that for two reasons. It was sent to me by a friend of mine. And I thank you for sending that. That was a sock account, and he knew I'd like that. There are a couple of reasons why I like that. I have worked for a number of political campaigns. I was professional political operative for a couple of years. I enjoyed it very much. I kind of miss it. Now I do this. But we'll talk about voting, I think, when it comes closer, and why it's so important. And this is one of those reasons, even when sometimes it feels like you're voting for the lesser of two candidates. If you vote for the lesser of two evils, well, we'll get into that when we talk about voting, I guess. But the other reason, aside from I thought that was very good, and I hope you will go to Legal and subscribe. There are a lot of things. Most people don't have a lot of free money. We've been hoarding toilet paper, food, and a lot of people are unemployed. It's the highest unemployment rate that we've ever seen in this country. And so I know money's tight, but the ACLU, which he spoke about, was instrumental in overturning Trump's Muslim ban. They overturned North Carolina's voter suppression laws. They ended the Defense of Marriage Act. They overturned voter ID in Pennsylvania and Arkansas. They exposed the U.S. torture in Iraq. They fought the Japanese internments in 1942. They defended John T. Snopes in what was later called the Monkey Trial. They defended him doing his job, teaching science, teaching reality. Brown versus Board of Education was the ACLU. That's why I have been a card-carrying member of the ACLU since 2005. There are a lot of important organizations that need help, and there are organizations but if you're looking for one, the ACLU is one that I've always supported. I don't agree with everything they do. They've done a few controversial things, but it's the importance of a nonprofit whose sole purpose it is to defend our constitutional rights from the government. Why this isn't seen as a right-wing organization, I'll have no idea. But I hope you'll consider taking his advice and joining the ACLU or supporting them. Either they send lawyers to people who can't afford them and who need them, and they're already on the ground in this, and they will be more so. We In Time will continue to broadcast and try to keep everyone as up to date as possible with what's going on right now. As I said, it's a lot of the protests and riots. We will bring you information as we get it. Anything that's important that we think you need to know. I think staying informed is the first and most important step in fixing things like this. That's why I'm proud of doing it. I think that's why those of us here at In Time, the volunteers, the mods, the people who work on the Discord, everybody, I think that's one of the reasons why we do it. So thank you all for your support. Thank you for coming, and I hope we will continue to live up to your expectations of getting information to you accurately, but also putting it in context. We will be on the Discord. We will be inviting people to have a discussion with us about what this means to them and how they think it's gonna, what solutions do we have ahead of us. In the meantime, please everyone do stay safe. Thank you all who have super chatted. We really appreciate that, and we look forward to seeing you guys very soon. Thank you.